You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer. You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This time we come to the subject of tragedy and hope, something that I've been intending to get to for a long time, and I hope that we can really cover a lot of ground. I'm not aware of anyone else doing a full talk series on the entire book, so I think that it's going to be beneficial. It's going to be a lot of talks that we've got here, and I think that you're going to want to take notes and enjoy it, because it's one of the most seminal books, I'd say, of the 20th century in terms of revealing really how geopolitics works and the strategy of what we're going to call the Atlanticist Anglo-American establishment, which is, of course, Quigley's term that he uses in another text that's of that same title, the Anglo-American Establishment, another book that he's written. And, of course, he also wrote on military history. But the reason that Tragedy and Hope is so significant is that it was intended to be a history of the 20th century from the perspective of the Western establishment and from the perspective of the CFR archives. And so that's why Quigley's book stands out. It's not your typical history of Western civilization. It's not your typical, Fernand Braudel book on the history of civilizations or something like that, sort of a mainline historian. It's really a policy book for those in the establishment. And, of course, Quigley was a Harvard University graduate, historian, then later at Georgetown University, where he spent the most of his career. And so what he's going to do is essentially put forth the real history from the archives of the Round Table Group, the Milner Group, and so forth, who will later in the book be called the Clivenden set, especially during the time of World War II, who we might just simply refer to as kind of the English-European banking dynasty. And eventually this will include the American banking dynasties, Rockefellers, Schiffs, Warburgs, and others, who, while they may have at times differences amongst themselves, various policies, family rivalries, in the big picture are actually not in opposition, but rather interested in consolidating power for the purpose of restructuring the globe and moving us into the age of transitions and global government. And in fact, Quigley will have an entire chapter where he talks about just that very thing, about the move into the third wave convergence period, which is what the globalists have planned for our era, roughly the past few decades and into the next few decades of the future. And what I think is the most telling about Quigley's book is that it's not a conspiracy book. It's an apologetic of sorts, because really Quigley's interested in saying, I have no aversions to the Western establishment's aims and goals. In fact, I think that it's the best hope for mankind, hence the title Tragedy. That would be, of course, the world wars of the last century, and then Hope, which would be, ultimately speaking, the extension of Western Atlanticist libertarian, even though he's not strictly a libertarian, but the basic ideas of liberal democracy, which need to be seeded in the rest of the globe. Now, of course, Quigley was Bill Clinton's mentor, and if you find the clips on YouTube, you can find Bill Clinton thanking his mentor, Carroll Quigley, for, sort of tutoring him, handling him, so to speak, at Georgetown. But there's also kind of a bit of mythology that's grown up around the book, which is difficult to ferret out. And so you'll hear all kinds of myths and stories and legends. I don't claim to know which ones are true or not true. I don't know how you could really verify these things. People say, oh, there was once a secret plates that were suppressed and the book wasn't supposed to be published because it showed too much, and oh, oops, they accidentally printed it. And I don't know that I believe all of that, because it's not like there aren't other books that tell you essentially the same game plan or strategy. Brave New World, right? I mean, if the bankers and the technocratic establishment was really worried about it, they would not have been published, right? But it's not like the establishment was worried about the publication of Brave New World. It was published on purpose by one of its top brains, Aldous Huxley. And it's the same, I would say, with Tragedy and Hope. They're not worried about this getting out, or else it wouldn't be out, right? I mean, it's kind of it's important to understand too, which people don't usually talk about, is that there's also propaganda in Quigley's book, right? It's a defense of the Western establishment. Now, some people will make these arguments, oh, Quigley was secretly trying to get out what he couldn't say, and no, he numerous times in the book defends the Western position in its various expansionist tendencies, colonialism, and so forth. He's at times critical of monetary policy and the hardcore libertarian, perspectives, I guess you could say. And so we might class him in this kind of democratic convergence perspective, as we said, this third wave, which was more popular, I think, in the back in the 60s and 70s when he was writing than it is nowadays. Even though really the Fabian third wave sort of blending of Eastern socialism and communism and Western capitalism is pretty much what's happening. Those terminologies are somewhat dated, right? So, figures like Alvin Toffler and so forth all have written and spoken of this phenomenon, this perspective. But as we said, the book is important because it's going to lay out the way that the Western establishment, which has the upper hand, obviously geopolitically, the way that it views geopolitics and why it views geopolitics the way it does and why it does what it does. Now, whether you think that's good or bad will, of course, be determined based on what you think of, what your worldview, right, tells you on how things are, and whether we live in a situation where the world has progressed to be something essentially much greater or more positive than it was decades or centuries ago, or whether you think that it maybe it's digressed, or maybe neither one. Maybe the world's just continuing on as it always has, with different power structures vying for power. Or maybe power doesn't change hands. Maybe power is always concentrated in central institutions. The irony, of course, will be that this newspeak about democracy that will play such an important role in Quigley's books and in Western propaganda and parlance is quite admittedly a fiction. And I think that's one of the first things that will stand out in Quigley's book, is that the lauding, praise, adulation, and so forth in terms of what democracy is and freedom is, that supposedly is represented by the West, and all other powers and forces in the world are, of course, by this sort of via negativa, this negation perspective, conceived of as, or demonized, right? Conceived of as anti-liberty. And we'll see this, of course, in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Cold War especially, and then nowadays in the War on Terror, right? The same refrain of propaganda and psychological warfare has been chanted for over a century now. And ultimately going back, certainly to the French Revolution, the chant of liberty, freedom, democracy, and equality. Right? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. We've seen all of this of Western civilization overturned, upturned, churned over, reorganized under this banner since the time of the French Revolution, and obviously it had precedents as well prior to that, scientific revolution, empiricism, and so forth, under the banner of liberty. And what's so startling about this is really the fact that it's been so successful precisely because it has no real context or fuller sense to give it meaning. It's just bare phraseology. It's sloganeering. At the time of the French Revolution, it was nationalism that was the libertarian movement, right? And over time, through large-scale banker geostrategic planning, nationalism has now become the far right ideology. Interesting. So what was libertarian, liberal, leftist at the time of the French Revolution, French nationalism, and so forth, has morphed, transmuted, and turned into now liberal global hegemony of the West. And that is the only representation of democracy and humanitarianism and so forth. For a good treatise on this, I would suggest, if you haven't heard it, listen to my interview with Alexander Dugin, Putin's former advisor, on this very topic, right? The liberal American world order. And that's what Quigley is going to treat at length and defend at length, the liberal American world order. Now, American here, of course, even strictly speaking, to be honest, is not the American people, right? It's not you and me and our buddies and so forth, and even our friends who went off to fight in foreign wars. That's not what makes up America, although to some degree it does, and especially if you are a soldier, right? You're fighting under the banner of America. Americanism is an ideology, and it's the ideology of classical Western liberalism that derives from the Enlightenment, comes to kind of a fruition in the French Revolution, and is based upon a whole host of philosophical and religious or anti-religious presuppositions that ultimately serve to remove, just like with Darwinism and scientism and so forth, coming out of the same period, remove any kind of metaphysical relations. In the 1700s, it would become replaced with materialism, and naturalism would become the new metaphysical god by which persons might find themselves united. And over several generations and centuries, we now see the flowering of Western, quote, liberty in the erasing of gender, right? Explicitly and perfectly, as Professor Dugin in that talk discusses, right, as the logical consequence of these positions. Well, how did we get here? Well, Quigley's going to tell us that. And so in the beginning of the book, he kind of lays out the strategy and the framework and briefly what gave rise to the success of Western civilization and its population increase. And he discusses things like revolutions in agriculture, revolutions in transportation, industrial revolution, right? All of these things, of course, lead up to, and of course, the philosophy, right? There are, one of the reasons for the success of Western philosophy historically in maintaining a general kind of tradition, I guess you could say, is the philosophy that undergirded it. And then Quigley begins, for example, on page 24, discussing what I just laid out, the various shifts, right, that will give birth to the 20th century. And Quigley lists as those shifts, as I said, many of the ones that I mentioned. Number one, the belief in the innate goodness of man. Number two, secularism. Exactly. Number three, belief in progress. Number four, liberalism. Number five, capitalism. Number six, faith in science. Number seven, democracy. Number eight, nationalism. Exactly. So all of the things that I've been telling you and all the things you've heard me say and write about for many years now. Here's Quigley telling you all of that. So I know what I'm talking about, right? I didn't invent my ideas. They're not, speculations. Here's the establishment telling you, right? And so Quigley then goes on to list a lot of the figures who, of course, would play prominently in the birth of these new ideas: De Maistre, Metternich, Jefferson, John Stuart Mill, John Locke, on and on and on. We could list, many of Newton, many of these figures that would be prominent luminaries and lights in the secular sense that would lead to the alteration of the way that Western civilization prior to this, which functioned on, depending on how rough or generically you want to define the term West, was monarchical. You had monarchy and you had the church, right? Throne and altar. And so the 8 points that he lists at that time, 1700s, so forth, constituted liberalism. And this is, of course, where we get the term the classical liberal tradition, right? Thomas Reed, right? John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Jefferson, Franklin, right? The fathers of America, Rousseau, and so on. And many of its predecessors, Saint Simon, Auguste Comte, and the Illuminists, Weishaupt, right? These all would play into Mazzini. Many of the even the Masonic orders and so forth would play into the European shift, as Quigley describes it. And that European shift, of course, is grounded in the notion of away with throne, away with altar. And this is explicitly mentioned in, I forget, one of the Scottish Rite, I think, or the Royal Arch maybe, where you vow or to, stab the bishop's mitre or something, you spit on it or something to that, whatever it is. But it's a vow to destroy throne and altar. For what? Well, for the erecting of the liberal, republican, democratic world order. And it's important to understand that though Quigley doesn't engage in anything really dealing with masonry, just replace all of his comments in the first few chapters about liberalism with masonry, and you've got the same thing, right? So it's a plan, which Quigley does talk about. The negative idea of the nature of evil flowed from the belief that human nature was good, and this comes out of the notion of liberalism from the Enlightenment, and the belief that society, collective social orders, were somehow inherently lesser or bad. And this is how we get the notion of classical liberalism. The state is evil because it is in some way a collective grouping or metaphysical category that is arbitrary and created, and therefore as a result the solution, the source of freedom for man is individual liberty. Now, this is why I don't class myself as a libertarian or a free marketer or a anarchist or any of these Enlightenment invented ideologies, is for, number one, because they're not good philosophy, and that would be because they are grounded in the notion of the idea that you can have a dialectical tension that is the source of freedom, right? So that somehow that atomistic individualism is the way or the means out of the box of this life, the prison and the struggle, and so forth. So whereas Thomas Hobbes would have said in Leviathan that life is nasty, brutish, and short, and the state is the Leviathan, and that's the only way to go. We're all part of this big collective entity, the state. The revolutionary dialectical opposite, which is controlled opposition, is the notion of individual libertarian freedom. Oh, if the state and collectivism is bad, then I must rush to the opposite, as humans often do, creatures of extremes. Then the opposite is the truth. And this is why we're all constantly manipulated and caught in dialectics, is because we think that if that equals bad, and the people that we've listened to who propagandize this tell us that collectivism, socialism are bad, then we must rush to the other end, to the freedom-loving libertarian forefathers and Jefferson and so forth. But the fathers of collectivism and the fathers of atomistic individual libertarianism are all members of the same lodges, aren't they? Now, they may have disputes and spats amongst them, but both the Eastern communism and the Western libertarian free marketers are all sons of the lodge. They're all sons of the widow, or whatever the Masonic terminology is. And they are all united in the rejection of metaphysical categories for nation, tribe, and embodied in the monarch and the church, and a sort of leveling attempt, right, where it becomes the goddess reason, right, not actually believed to be a real goddess, but the symbolic embodiment of human rationality and reason, right? And we see this today in its full flowering with transgenderism, right? Because if all external metaphysical categories, such as belonging to the human race, right? That's a collective belonging to a family, belonging to the gender of male, right? These all become tyrannies in modern, full-fledged, coming to its full conclusion liberalism. So we live in the liberal era, whether we even know it or not. We swim in its sea. We are sons and daughters of its milieu, zeitgeist, and ethos, whether we know it, acknowledge it, or even care. And so we can truly speak of the spirit of our times as, quote, liberal. But the irony, of course, as even we'll see with Quigley, is that this liberal belief is fiction. It's not true liberty. It is rather a reorganization and new business phase by which to reorganize the globe under the banner of liberty. Meanwhile, everyone is kept in abject slavery, embodied, as I said, in the final revolution of Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley, the total technocratic state. And Quigley will deal with that in a chapter. He will actually discuss that we are now moving into the age of total technocratic expert control. The experts, right? It makes me think of Alan Watt always talking about, oh, you see, the experts. Quigley. Oh, you see, Carroll Quigley told you you'd be under the rule of the experts, you see. Right, the experts. And that Quigley has a chapter on that. So Alan Watt is correct in that statement. But most of the persons who in the alternative sphere, so to call, which I hate all of that. I don't like being classed with it. They're going to tell you that the answer and the way out of all of this mess is more of 1776, right? We need more of what was the venom that started this whole problem of the modern world. And if you doubt me, right, all you libertarians and anarchists out there, just read page 24 of Quigley's book. What is the modern liberal era grounded in? Belief in the innate goodness of man, secularism, belief in progress, liberalism, capitalism, faith in science, scientism, democracy, and nationalism. These are liberal movements of yesteryear. Now, Western Civilization to 1914 will begin the first section of the book, and here what stands out is the fact that we're not going to get really deep into kind of the boring things of all the economic facts and figures. We're going to focus on sections such as page 47, where Quigley says, considering the bankers, okay, banker power, and this is what's going to characterize the modern era. The modern liberal era is Homo economicus, okay? Another very wise man, Oswald Spengler, who wrote The Decline of the West, another great civilization treatment, wrote that we have passed out of Western Faustian man, as he called it. This is Western man seeking, always to explore, to expand, to create civilization and so forth. And we pass out of that into the modern era of decay that Spengler titled the dominance of the money power, right? Homo economicus. So out of Faustian man into Homo economicus, monetary quantitative man. And again, this is a natural corollary to the liberalism, capitalism, democracy, nationalism, scientism, secularism, and monetarism, materialism of the European shift that Quigley talks about. So naturally, that shift away from the belief in metaphysical truths and principles is what gives rise to going to Dallas or New York and seeing the tallest buildings being banks. Okay, banks are the new cathedral. The banking cathedral, right, is what defines the modern era, and Quigley talks about that. Okay, so it is a banker conspiracy. Don't ever doubt that. And so when discussing the bankers on page 47, Quigley says, moreover, their relationships with governments were always in monetary terms, not real terms. So the banker's angle was always about money with governments. Why is that? Well, because they were obsessed, he says, with the stability of monetary exchanges between one country's money system and another, and they used this power of influence to do two things. Number one, to make all money and debt expressed explicitly and strictly in terms of a single limited commodity, which they controlled, of course, gold. So prior to 1914, Western civilization was about a banker-determined gold standard. Okay. And what was number two here, Quigley? Two, to get all monetary systems and matters out of control of the government into private banking hands. That is crucial because, number one, you are going to see endlessly regurgitated and repeated in the libertarian, patriotard, alt media, Tea Party circus, the ridiculous moniker that if we could only go back to the gold standard in 1776 and blah, 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 blah. Well, that's an older Bankster model. Duh. It's right here in Quigley's book on page 47. And Quigley says right after that, the whole point of this was to shift commercial capitalism into mercantilism and the whole pattern of social organization around dynastic monarchy to restructure it. So the whole point of all that was restructuring society out of monarchies and an older form of commercial capitalism that would be East India Company, Hudson Bay Company, Dutch Company, Virginia Company, and so forth. These great predecessors to the modern corporation, which were at that time licensed state corporations, and shift away into private banking control of monetary systems. That was the bankers' entire strategy prior to 1914. Now, this does not just include Jewish bankers. It includes all the big banking houses and dynasties in all the countries, including Japan. All right, so persons who obsess over Jews all day, you will find Quigley's chapter on Japan very relevant, because Japan will eventually fall into the hands of a handful of Japanese bankers. Now, from here, Quigley says the period of commercial capitalism, okay, which he calls the period of 1440 to 1850. Okay, this is the monarchy stamped companies. Okay, and again, East India Company, right? Hudson Bay Company, Virginia Company. Those monarchy stamped companies are done away with. That's what the bankers want. And how and why do they do this? Well, they want control. Why? And the means by which they do this is the libertarian philosophy. It's 1776 and 1789. That's not me, okay, if you're mad out there. It's page 47 in Quigley. Okay, it's the first chapter and it's the second chapter. Now, you can think of that what you want, but that's what he says. Now, how else did they do this scam? Well, Britain, of course, will figure into this in a key role. particularly from 1770 to 1850 in the industrial capitalism period, where Britain achieved victories over Louis XIV, right, in the 1660s, and then the French Revolutionary government with Napoleon, also Britain victory there as well, 1792 to 1815, leads, of course, to the predominance of the British Empire, the Anglo-American establishment. Now, the Anglo-American establishment, the earlier form, right, the British Empire, this is not a empire, as we said, of the people. Okay? It's a shadow banking empire. And more or less, Quigley will say that, right? Because he just talked about how the bankers wanted to get the monarchs in their pocket. And that's what they did. Get them in debt. Run the countries up debt-wise. Get those monarchs into your pocket, and then the monarchs become your puppets. You can get them to do what you want because they owe you billions of dollars, okay? And wars help that, right? So we all know about these stories of the Rothschilds and Napoleon and Waterloo and so forth, right? Now, again, the whole point, run up everybody's credit. Get them in debt. And this is the old banker trick. Now, how do they do this? Well, here we go. For generations, men had sought to avoid the one drawback of gold, its heaviness, by using pieces of paper, gold notes, right, to represent the specific pieces of gold, right? Gold's heavy. We're going to use gold as a currency. Well, we might as well have pieces of paper to represent the gold, because then it's not, you're not lugging around 600 pounds worth of gold to buy your groceries. Now, today we call these gold certificates, he says, but such a certificate entitles the bearer to exchange it for a piece of gold on demand. But in view of the convenience of paper, only a small fraction of certificate holders ever did make such demands, right? So very few people actually went and claimed their gold with a gold certificate. They left it in the bank and they used the notes. Now, what did this do? Well, this allowed the gold holders to print gold certificates, right? Accordingly, the rest of the gold could be used for business purposes, right? And so here we have at the beginning of fractional reserve banking with gold notes, gold reserved for payments and demands against them and so forth, right? Such an excess volume of paper claims against reserves that we now call banknotes. In effect, the creation of paper claims greater than the reserves of all available means that the bankers were creating money out of nothing. Fiat, beginning of the idea of fiat currency in the modern era. The same could be said in another way, that by issuing banknotes, the same could be done in another way, he says, not by banknotes, but by deposit banks. Deposit banks discovered that orders and checks drawn against deposits and given to third persons were often not cashed. So if they weren't cashed, it's just sitting there, and you can kind of do what you want with this gold, right? Well, then print up gold certificates. Accordingly, it was necessary for the banker to keep on hand in actual money no more than the fraction of the deposits that were likely to be drawn upon and cashed in. So if you have $1 billion in gold, or so let's say you got $1 million in gold, and every year only $1,000 worth of that is actually cashed, you can do what you want with all of this extra gold and make up gold certificates. So this created deposits and gave the appearance of value when there was nothing actually backing up the value except for the original amount of gold, right? But you could say, well, I've got $1 billion worth of bank gold notes, right? When you only had $1 million worth of gold in the bank, and you could get away with this because only a fraction of that people are actually going to claim their gold. And in England in 1694, the Bank of England, William Patterson said about the charter of the Bank of England, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of thin air." So there you go. Even in 1694, this trick was being used through the Bank of England. And of course, the Bank of England was prominent, centrally prominent in this era. And again, this is not the bank of the government of England. This is the bank of private families that own the shares and the stocks in the Bank of England, which the people of England think is the bank of the people of England. Now, the nature of business and globalism and empire and so forth is such that these bankers, and by extension their corporate buddies, want to be international. You don't want to just be a local businessman. You want to be Globocorp. You want to be Globobank. And so this impetus for globalism is what would propel the great banking dynasties that Quigley lists, right, behind the Bank of England and others, as the Rothschilds. Right, now this is page 51. So there you go. Now, so we've seen then that this banker scam is very real. It's this trick that we've heard talked about in alternative media, for so long. And we might think of, say, Ron Paul talking about the Federal Reserve and all this private establishment banking in the hands of the money printers and them running up debts and so forth through fiat currency. Now, all that's true. The only problem is that Ron Paul's answer in philosophy, for example, is a banker philosophy. It's the older banker philosophy, which Quigley says in chapter 1 and 2. So if you take issue with that, that's fine. That's your issue. I'm telling you what the establishment itself knows and says about its own philosophies and plans and strategies, and which ones worked and didn't work. So when you're trying to say, oh, we need more 1776 to solve 1984. 1776 was beta 1984. Okay, 1984 is 2.0, and now we're moving beyond 1984. So you're not going to solve modern problems with the very thing that started the modern era. And again, this is all in Quigley. So stop being so stupid, please. Who are these big banking families of this period, right? The late 1800s and into the early 1900s. They are Baring, Lazard, Erlinger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, Speyer, Mirabaud, Mallet, Bould, Rothschild, Morgan. All of those are Anglo and Jewish, okay? And that's the power structure behind, that's the real shadow government of the Atlanticist Anglo-American establishment. So it's not all Jewish. It's not all Nazi. It's not all one thing. It's all of these banking houses that are mega rich. And they're not all Jewish, but they're also not all Calvinist or Protestant or Catholic, right? It's a combo of them all. And you can do with that what you want, but that's the truth, okay? Now, he says these banking houses were cosmopolitan and international. Okay, now this is why we get all the internationalist movements in the modern era. Okay, international communism, international capitalism. It's because the bankers behind it are internationalists, right, for their interests. And that begins to key you into the fraud nature of Marxism, because Marxism is international. It shares all of its same plans, goals, and strategies of the capitalists. It just differs on the road by which you get to the same end goal. Right? We're all on the bus to hell, but are we going to take the left fork in the road or the right fork in the road? Oh, well, it doesn't matter, because both forks in the road end up in the pits of hell. So there you go. Now, sometimes the Marxist path down the road is a quicker and better route to hell and banker control. Sometimes capital, it just depends, right? I mean, some countries, the strategy of introducing Marxism works better, right? That's where the bankers foisted Marxism upon Russia. Some places, a top-down monarch like Jordan or Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, that works better, right, to getting to the end goal. Sometimes, quote, democracy works better, right? It just depends. And it doesn't matter which one of these phony baloney systems you institute. They're all at the behest of the same banker strategy. So here's Quigley. Quigley tells you all this on page 52 and 53. and it's all a scam that's practiced principally through the banking and central banking monetary system, which is not public, it is private. So the libertarians that tell you that the problem is that the banking establishment is public and not private are lying to you, or they're telling you half the story. Right now, the Federal Reserve does have this air of being governmental because it's under the Treasury Department, but the money in the stock, the stock, the controlling interests are owned by private families, and it's always been that way. And you're going to see that pattern in Tragedy and Hope, where Quigley's going to show you that through the money supply, controlling the money supply, through inflation, through printing, through fiat currency, this is how they've always been able to wreck economies, regulate, steer, create a boom as well through the money system. And it really is that simple. Now, the scams can get very complex, and we can get buried and lost in mountains of banking regulations and complexities and all this and so forth, but it's very simple, and that's essentially Quigley's point, is telling you that it's just the same basic scam that is varied and multiplies in different places at different times. And as we're going to see, it's going to, in the modern era, especially after World War II, fall under the aegis of the Bank for International Settlements, right? The central bank of central banks, as it's known, as it's called. So, as we said here, kind of in this intro talk, we're not gonna waste time speculating about conspiracy theories about Quigley's own life and Quigley's book and it being suppressed and all this kind of stuff. It's a waste of time. You're never gonna determine any of that anyway. Why don't we just dive into the book and see what he says? Okay. That's a much better use of our time than wasting time speculating about it. And this always comes up, right? Like when if you talk about Quigley, people come on your blog and they comment, and they put these long, sprawling tomes of them telling you what really went on with the Quigleys and the plates that were going to be used to print Tragedy and Hope. Who cares, dude? Then you're not going to figure any of that out. I just wanted to see what's in the book. Okay, so this thing's 1,300 pages, so let's get into it, because we're never going to get to the bottom of which conspiracy theory about Quigley's life is true. Now, one of the first things I noticed as I was reading was this chapter 3 is about Russia. And it is a very bad propaganda chapter about Russia. This is the first thing that clues you into the fact that, wait a minute, now Quigley's got an agenda here. Okay, now he's obvious. He's ultimately going to be very open about his agenda and so forth. But when you begin the book and you're reading the Russia chapter, you're like, whoa, dude. Especially if you know Russian history to some degree, or if you know the history of the Orthodox Church or the East and Christianity, medieval Christianity, be it Byzantium or the Roman Empire, you know that Quigley's not honest here. Okay, he's written a propaganda chapter, and what's it about? Well, to basically say Russian civilization, which he does talk about, the Russian Empire, right, up to 1917. Oh, they're all backwards and they're dumb, and they just don't get it, and they're savage, and Western civilization is so great. Right? We're progressive and liberal and secular, and see, those Russians are all so backwards. Right? They believe in the church and Orthodox theology. Oh, give me a break, right? I mean, come on, man. We know that secularism and scientism is where it's at, and that's what he does. Right? So beginning on chapter 3, page 81. Oh, Byzantium is just the worst thing ever. Russians. Oh, it's Dark Ages. It's just, they're all just backwoods, and they don't know their butt from a hole in the ground, but the West, of course, does. And ironically, this is right after he's just talked about how the New Freedom Initiative of Woodrow Wilson in 1912 was a bunch of banker scams, right, for getting the U.S. into the war, right, World War I. And how the bankers were pretty much behind Woodrow Wilson and the passing of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. And, again, this is all that. So, in other words, for Quigley, admittedly, being liberal and progressive is being a slave to a bunch of banking scams and guys running your central banking system scamming you. That's progressive and liberal. But a Russian empire, that's dark ages. So now it doesn't matter whatever you think of Russian empire. Okay, but what I'm saying is, do you see how this is propaganda, right? Why do I need what is this, 80, 100, no, 40 pages, 50, why do I need 50 pages telling me how bad Russia is, right? Well, it's because Quigley is writing for the Western establishment, and he's writing concerning the Great Game, which he talks about, and this is the long battle between the British Empire and Russia for global strategic dominance, particularly when we think of the heartland theory of Halford Mackinder and so forth, versus the Eastern different philosophy of the world, right? From Russia. It's different, and from Eurasia. And Dugan points this out in one of his talks very well, that, basically what Quigley exemplifies here is just a supremely Eurocentric perspective, right? And by extension, America is Eurocentric as well, right? Just this idea that because we're in the West and because we have, quote, democracy, that this gives us some sort of legitimacy and superiority, some moral superiority to voice this everywhere in the world and to consider everything else dark ages. Well, no, I'm sorry, but the Enlightenment, scientism, scientific revolution, these are scams from more wicked, nefarious scamsters, okay? So whatever evils are going on in Russia and so forth, the Western establishment is run by total viper bankers who are 10 times worse. That's the point. And that is the hypocrisy of Quigley, especially in this Russian Empire chapter, right? Pages 90 to 110, 105, right? And Quigley's going to talk about the Russian ethos, Russian nationalism, and by extension, Russian imperialism, the philosophy of Russia, and how it's grounded in Orthodox theology. It's an extension of Byzantium from Saints Cyril and Methodius, right? He will talk about different Russian philosophers and their impact, different Russian rulers, and then the Slavic mind itself, right, as well as, I guess you could say, Eurasia by extension, China and so forth. But really, he's got to hone in and talk about how bad Russia is, right? And so pretty much everything bad is located from the East, from Russia. Socialism and communism and Marxism, those are bad because they're in Russia. Oh, but by the way, Quigley, aren't you actually going to talk about the fact that the revolutions are funded by the bankers? Well, he does. Yet the Russians are still bad for the socialism and the communism. But it was foisted by the bankers. So, come on here, right? Stop contradicting yourself and be consistent. So yeah, this is really a propaganda hit piece on Russia, and I mean, it's just it's bad, right? Because he tries to talk about Jesus, and in this retarded section, the idea that Russia is supposed to be Christian but doesn't follow Jesus, as if the West and bankers followed. Jesus went into the temple and cleansed it of bankers. So come on, Quigley, right? And here on page 102, 103, he's trying to talk about Russian Orthodox theology, which he has absolutely no understanding of. He has no clue. He's a bat in a blind bat in flying towards the sun. I mean, he just has no idea where he's going, what's going on. And he's one of the worst things he does is try to talk about philosophy and theology, because he's just has no clue what he's talking about when he talks about these things. So he tries to talk about Christian heresies and Neoplatonism, and these actually constitute some of the worst parts of the book. So he has no idea what he's talking about when he tries to explain the Greek, Byzantine, Russian civilization. And he ends it by saying that mystical Slav imperialism is apocalyptic and it's going to destroy the world. And the real danger is that because Russia sees itself as the third Rome, right? And this is just the worst thing ever. And so the third Rome idea, he says, is what merged with Lenin and Marxism to provide the ideology of Soviet Russia after 1917. Well, that's kind of true, except that it's not, Russia is just not the villain of the world. If anything, Russia constitutes, I would say, a large hope for the world. And it is the Western Atlanticists who are basically telling little boys and girls to cut off their genitalia and become genderless goblins. Okay, that's the real villains. Right? Now, Quigley, you are a hypocrite because you should have seen and should know. If would you still be saying this, Quigley? Right? If you saw where Western liberalism was today, that it would be wrecking children. Russia is not wrecking children globally. The Western banking establishment and Atlanticists are. So Quigley, you've got to rethink and repent, and you've got to you really need to answer for your, on the one hand, description of the bankers as these scamsters who control governments, and then turn around and talk about all the countries that the bankers target, right, to destroy as the bad guys. What hypocrisy. Amazing hypocrisy, actually. Phenomenal. Especially when on page 63 you talk about international financial practices and the ability of the bankers to even co-opt the U.S., right, and bring the U.S. into all of these foreign conflicts, which the Founding Fathers, not that I'm even interested in the Founding Fathers, I don't care for the Founding Fathers, but they at least talked about not being involved in foreign entanglements and expansionism and so forth. But no, Quigley, you will talk about it and in total hypocrisy turn around and talk about Russia as the enemy when it's the Western bankers who sought to wreck Russia through Marxism and Leninism and so forth. And of course this and your very infantile understanding of Byzantium orthodoxy and philosophy, I think, is very telling as well. You're a military historian, but you're going to talk about theology? Give me a break. You don't even know what the apocalypse is. So I'm not going to pay much attention to Quigley trying to talk about Russian theology and the Cathari and the Gnostics. Right? So this is traversing into fields in which he has no clue. Now that's going to be, I think, a good place to kind of conclude the free section of hour one, beginning in Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. And so we've kind of seen how he set the stage with the idea of the Banksters seeking libertarian philosophy to free the monetary policies of countries from the state so that it can be put into private hands, and then through the private banking establishment behind a shadow facade of a public banking institution, they can then control nation states. And that is all admitted, and that was the logical stage, the necessary progression from the presuppositions of the European shift, which Quigley calls the Enlightenment period, of the secularism, the nationalism, the capitalism, private banking, liberalism, and so forth. And then we saw how this required from him in his propaganda section a virulent anti-Russian treatise chapter that grounds this all in the great game and has no understanding of theology, of course. So, but what do you expect from this guy? And what we're going to see in the next section is how this then will lead to the new power structure. I don't guess you'd call it new, but the main players, the power structure of this period, right? 20th century, end of the 19th and into the 20th century. And this will be the Cecil Rhodes, Milner, Rothschilds, and the Round Table Group. And from there, Royal Society, Royal Institute for International Affairs, and so forth. And this is the power block of the West. This is the center of power of the Atlanticist Anglo-American banking establishment. And we're going to see how from there, that's going to propel the rest of the century, right? The entire 20th century will be played out on a chessboard, the grand chessboard that Brzezinski will talk about, from the vantage point of this Cliveden and Set Milner roundtable banking families, basically moving the chess pieces of Europe and the globe around to reorganize it. And that's what we're going to see from Quigley. And again, it's ultimately, even from this period, about global government because of the fact that these people are internationalists. This is everything that Quigley talks about. Now, does Quigley say, oh, they're immediately planning global government in a kind of New World Order sense? Not exactly, but he's essentially saying that because they're internationalists who run an empire, and that's what it's all about. And so when you see one of their brains, Huxley, laying it out in Brave New World, or Bertrand Russell laying it out in Impact of Science and Society and so forth, and his other books, the other Royal Society members laying it out, right? The bankers laying it out in their books, and you can view Tragedy and Hope as a book of the bankers. Okay, it's about global government. He doesn't have to say New World Order. It doesn't matter. That's what it's about. It's empire, but it's not empire in the older British colonial sense. It's a new way of doing empire through democracy, which is hypocritical because he's going to attack Russia for speaking of the Russian Empire, right? The czars and so forth, the double-headed Byzantine eagle. That's all evil because why? Because it's not an empire of democracy. Which is all a complete scam. And we're going to see, again, not just because it's bankers foisting all of this democracy scam upon the world, but we're going to see a lot more explicit proof, quotes, citations, and references that are going to show that to be the case, that it is the Milner, Oxford, Roundtable, Royal Society groups that will form the locus of power for the entire Anglo-Atlanticist American establishment. And it will be really in this period, even extending prior to 1900, late 1890s with Afghanistan, the Great Game. It's largely about Russia because Russia is really seen to be the only potential possible major threat to the Atlanticist establishment, going back at least that far and then further, right? So the division goes back, and we could place this division even further than that, back to 1054 and the split between the Roman Church and the Orthodox Church. Right now, Russia will come into the picture later as a major power, but the ideology that will separate East and West will really, theologically at least, church-wise, which is a big part of culture and civilization, go back to that period, right, with the writings that we read from, say, St. Photius, right, on the against the Western view of Augustinian Trinitarianism and the Filioque. And then, of course, Saints Kirill and Methodius, who will give the Russian and the Slavs the Cyrillic alphabet, right? That is all going to give rise to a different mindset, a different perspective in the East, in Eurasia, than the Eurocentric, Anglocentric liberalism, right, of the UK, the liberalism of its colonies. Right. So you've been listening to Hour 1 as we've done our first lecture in Tragedy and Hope. And to hear the rest of the talk, you'll want to go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe for $4.95 a month or $60 a year. You can also purchase my book, Esoteric Hollywood Sex Cults and Symbols in Film, which ties all of this, a lot of this, into movies and the hidden meanings and patterns and structures in film. And you can also purchase Jamie Hanshaw's book, Hidden Hollywood Mind Control. Right. So definitely go check those out. And in Hour 2, we're going to continue with this initial period of around 1914, right, up to the period of the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of World War One, and how World War One was kind of a banker trick. No surprises there, right? All right, as we come to Hour 2, we're going to discuss kind of the lay of the land prior to World War One, and we have kind of Quigley basically talks about the decline of the British Empire, and of course the British Empire, the British Navy, right, legendary fleet, decline of the Ottoman Empire as well, another rival to the British. And this represents you can think of it the way that Dugan discusses, say, the land power and the sea power, with Russia and Eurasia representing the land power, also the Mackinder doctrine that, for example, Brzezinski speaks of, where he discusses in the Grand Chessboard that the control of Eurasia is really the central way to rule the globe. And so for American predominance to have sway, Brzezinski argues the U.S. has to control Eurasia. And this is, again, an older geopolitical idea that goes back to Sir Halford Mackinder, another British lord. And it's the decline of the British Empire that really, I think, leads to this rise of a shadow empire. The British Empire gave way to the banking empire, which then kind of used different entities as fronts. Right, the British government would become a front. The European, the EU, all will emerge out of this same shadow banking establishment. The U.S. also, even though for a time fought for independence from the shadow banking establishment, eventually that doesn't last very long. As Quigley will say, by 1900, a handful of countries or banking houses controlled half of the assets of the U.S. So if you control half the assets, you already control the country for the most part. And that was by 1900. So that's even prior to 1913, the Federal Reserve, and the mythology that it's overnight that the bankers took over America. No, the bankers have had control of America for a long time. Again, even the founding fathers, for the most part, are Masons, rationalists, deists, and partisans of the Lodge and the philosophy of the Lodge. So the great powers, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, are all kind of battling to divvy up the globe around this period, and it's the British who pretty much, I would say, you could argue, set up the real secret society that runs the globe. Okay, so John Ruskin at Oxford is going to be a central figure in this, and that he really forges the way for the continuance of the idea of the Anglophile network, the Anglo-American establishment, civilizing the globe. His message filtered down to one of his students, Cecil Rhodes, who was a Mason and basically mined the diamonds and gold fields of South Africa to become his own sort of banker, legate, lord there, working with Rothschild money. So it's important to understand that Cecil Rhodes was not on his own, but was actually a legate to the Rothschilds and the banking establishment back home. And Rhodes gets the idea to corner the market in diamonds through the De Beers Consolidated Mines and he sets up kind of the earliest forms of concentration camps, and it's really on the one hand, you could argue that yes, it did in ways civilize Africa, but it also prepared the model for the global order, where the New World Order is based on this older idea of the British Empire and bringing the Pax Britannia to the world. But with the decline of Britain as a power and the rise of other groups that could be contentious or in contention with the British, such as America, possibly, such as Germany, such as on the continent, of course, especially Germany, and this will be part of the reason for the wars, to weaken and disrupt Germany as a potential threat, and Russia. Right, Russia has to be dealt with through the exportation of communism and so forth, Marxism, Leninism, Trotskyism, that destroys Russia as a force and turns it into a Cold War stooge of the West ultimately. Then, by the time of the Clinton era, the looting of Russia. So this Anglo strategy, right, and it's Clinton and his cronies who looted Russia in the 90s. This Atlantis strategy that's so successful because it basically just exports whatever's the worst thing specific to that people group to wreck them. And this was learned through the strategies and methods and machinations of persons like Cecil Rhodes in South Africa. And so these monopolies will form the pattern for the methods of what the round table groups will try to implement. And it's here that we get these round table groups, right? From Oxford, the Rhodes Scholarship is the means by which people would be brought into the Oxford networks to be the thinkers that would help implement the New World Order. And so later this would include Arnold Toynbee, of the author of the famous Civilization Study as well, Alfred Lord Milner, Arthur Glazebrook, George Parkin, Philip Littleton, Gell, Henry Birkenau, Sir John Seeley, Albert Lord Grey, Edmund Garrett, Reginald Balliol, Brett, that is Lord Esher. Right, these are all the circles. William T. Stead, ardent social reformer and imperialist, brought into association with Rhodes. Lord Balfour, Lord Rothschild, Lord Grey. The circle of initiates, they are called. That's the inner circle. The inner circle. The real Illuminati. And the outer circle of the dupes and idiots. The Association of Helpers. What a name. The Helpers. The Association of Helpers working for the Illuminati. This is the real Illuminati. Okay, I'm not talking about some 1700s group of rationalist ideologues. I'm talking about hardcore social engineering eugenicist lords of London. Okay, this is the real Illuminati. And that is what most people don't understand. Okay, it's not dark occultists in labs and magical towers and castles. Well, I guess some of these people are, I guess, dark occultists in towers, but it's the social engineering lords of London. That is the Illuminati, the real one. If by that you mean the people who have determined and run the 20th century, created and called for its wars, established the round table groups that would become the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which would become the models, Chatham House for Pratt House, and for the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and so forth, the Institute for Pacific Studies. the Asia Society. All these different spin-offs come out of this central group and locale. This is the real Illuminati. I can't stress that enough, because if people aren't talking about this, Rhodes, Ruskin, Milner, Balfour, right? And this would also, of course, include the Saxe-Coburg, Gotha, German, Romanian family that runs the British Empire. The so-called what's their name that they go under, the Windsors, right? Yeah, right. The Saxe-Coburg, Gotha, right? Germanic lords of London. That's who really controls things. Now, they through Disraeli and Rothschild and their circles gobbled up the Suez Canal, right? So they got control of the Suez Canal. This is on page 133. He calls them the Cliven set, as I said before. This also includes the Astor family. Can't forget the Astors. Many names could be included in this circle. I don't know them all, obviously, but you're getting the idea of who the central people are. And he mentions the Stevenson chair at Chatham House. Chatham House. Very, very important. Page 133. This is the Illuminists of the 1920s. The Rhodes Milner group, spoken of as the Cliven set, named after the Astor country house where they met. And Rhodes spoke of it as a secret society, I might add. So it is not out of place to speak of it as a secret society. And he talks about Milner's Kindergarten, one of the groups to train people up for this, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Chatham House. He talks about the institutes, the CFR, right? This is all 100% explicit, explained right here on page 132 and 133. Crucial. And I probably should read it all to really give you. Well, you've got the idea. I'm not going to read these 3 pages, but 131, 132, 133, and Benjamin Disraeli, the agent of the Rothschilds with Rothschild money, buys the Suez Canal, and this, at this time at least, is what in 1875, right, helps secure British imperial power. It's a very, very important geostrategic area to control. Now, and that will also be a geostrategic region that others will try to control, right? And it's very interesting that it's mentioned right here in this section, or right after the section of the, who these power players are, is the control of the Suez Canal under the power of Rothschild through their agent Benjamin Disraeli. So, that's what we're looking at. And that makes, I think, other people suspect too, right? Who, for example, what was her name? Benazir Bhutto, right? She goes to Oxford, if I recall, and then ends up president of Pakistan, a British creation. And she's supposedly then assassinated. Well, maybe, right? Or was she just playing along in the script and doing her job as she was supposed to? And again, Lord Rothschild comes up quite frequently here in the secret society of Rhodes. The Boers are mentioned as well, and the support of the Boers in Africa, because a lot of this originally is dealing with the control of diamonds. Okay, so this is the Johannesburg, and the money is coming from the control of these precious metals and gold. And this is where the Rhodes Milner group really siphons away a lot of the wealth under this colony to the shadow banking mafia. So that's what's important, is to understand that this is a mafia. Okay, they're a mafia, and they are engaged in black markets. That's where they get their power, including drugs, as we'll see. Now, the Rhodes-Milner Roundtable Group also tended to have its own papers and means by which it would propagate its propaganda. So these included the Observer. A lot of these were kind of based out of the Chatham House as well. The Times, the Roundtable, and other foreign magazines such as they would produce gigantic volumes, the African Survey, right? And these were detailed accounts of the operations of the empire in other countries. And so, again, a lot of this is built out of Africa and the diamond trade, De Beers, and the gold mines of Africa. The Round Tablers, as we said, and the Clivenden set. They're going to form the locus of power of the Atlanticist establishment. Now, as Quigley discusses in pages 147 to 50, this is where we get the League of Nations, and this is going to come out of this same circles, the drawing up of the League of Nations out of the roundtable groups. And so this is discussed, as we said, around page 150, the League of Nations mandate system. And then, as we'll see later, of course, World War I will produce League of Nations. World War II will produce United Nations. And both of these are the nascent attempts towards world government. And as we said, again, you have to understand that it's colonies that are paying obeisance, right? The energy, the wealth is being sucked back to home base, not under the banner of empire. Ultimately, that's kind of the facade, that's the front that's put up. But really and truly, it's under the banner of banksters, shadow banking empire. And that's what's most important. Her Majesty, His Majesty's government, Her Majesty's government, those function as the set pieces, the frontispiece for this banking establishment that is tied into this Clivenden set. And so it's the bankers, the brains, and the bloods, all kind of in the same cadre here. And we mentioned all these people before, many of the names. I won't go over all the names again. But Quigley, in the next several chapters, will talk about the tie-ins to the East India Company, or excuse me, the next several sections of this chapter, the buffer fringe, and how the papers of this period, the early teens, right, like 1900 to 1914 up to World War I, are heavily engaged in promoting propaganda, right? That's their job, is propaganda arms of the establishment. And that's important because we tend to think of, propaganda as this thing that's come about since maybe World War II, or, Cold War propaganda, or propaganda during the events of 9/11 and post 9/11. These are the periods in which we see this ramp up of propaganda. Well, as Quigley will say several chapters in, we'll learn, the papers at this time were owned by the elites, the banksters, right? The big money. And the papers at this time were publishing fake stories. They were publishing propaganda. Nothing new under the sun, as Solomon says. Now, in this section on the buffer zone, we have the buffer fringe, we have a discussion on tariffs and taxation and the abolition of slavery in 1843, and how Quigley discusses the fact that in the West, the economic situation was not that great. And so even after slavery, he says many of the poor were reduced to peonage by contracting debts at unfair terms, binding themselves to essentially another form of slavery to creditors. So even The facade of getting rid of slavery was actually so that you could go into a deeper form of wage slavery. And this is page 157. And so, low point in economics, 1901. He says things improve a bit in the next decade or two. And of course, we have the boom of the 20s, and then the boom bust of the banker-initiated depression. But before we get to all that, he's going to discuss the decline in the empire of Britain's territories and the decline of Ottoman Empire. And this is going to lead, of course, to the rise of the American century, we could say. This again, is not really about America. It's rather the America that is already run by the same banking dynasties. And there's an interesting discussion of Hinduism and Hindu thought in India, because, of course, the British losing India, supposedly, we're told, right, because of opposition from persons like Gandhi and these different figures who were, or the Colonel Dyer's putting down of the rebels in India, and the Dyer massacre, as it's called. No relation, to my knowledge. I don't know that I'm related to Colonel Dyer. Could be. I don't know that, but I'm not glad that he massacred people if we are related. But other writers have proposed this, and now this is not what Quigley goes into, but other writers have proposed the thesis that Gandhi was not so holy a man as he appeared. In fact, there is potential evidence that Gandhi may have actually been a British agent. And now, why would that be? Well, Gandhi, you could steer a movement of opposition through creating an opposition, right? So you can take the opposition movement in India into something so-called peaceful, nonviolent, and then set up your own men as the leaders of this new movement. And so this is pages 164 and 5, where Quigley goes into what the Round Table machinations in India were, and how exactly Lord Curzon and these different characters who would play heavily into a lot of the usage of Islam by the British Empire, which is, of course, the old strategy and plan that we know from my previous talk on Dreyfus's book, Devil's Game, and Mark Curtis's book, Secret Affairs. And it looks like, it makes sense to presume that the same thing would be going on in India. Maybe not the same methodologies of using Salafists and Wahhabists, but rather co-opting the incoming movements. Now, that might call into question later successors in the Gandhi dynasty, Indira Gandhi as well. Perhaps these are Western agents or assets or persons amenable to the Anglo-American establishment. It would look to me that way, but that's just, again, that's kind of my suspicion. I can't really prove that, although I think maybe Stephen Dorrell in his book on MI6 maybe discusses, maybe not, I can't remember. I know that he discusses Nelson Mandela being an asset of MI6, but I can't recall who it is that's proposed the thesis that Gandhi was actually an agent of the British Empire. But Gandhi is discussed on page 170, as I said, 171, Colonel Dyer and the massacre. General Dyer. Dyer's barbarity is considered a grave error of judgment. We can't forget Lord Halifax. And this is in the Gandhi section where Gandhi chose the path of civil disobedience, and he's supposed to be, of course, this image of the great the peace, nonviolent resistance, right? MLK, Gandhi, these people that leftist causes worship like they're gods. And let's see what Quigley says about Gandhi. He says, Gandhi and his masses expected and demanded a greater degree of self-government after World War I. The Act of 1919 provided that. Much of the Indians would get what they were entitled to. The Act anticipated the expansion of areas of government. The act was largely a failure. Gandhi aroused political ambitions in a great mass of Indians who lacked experience in political activities. And these demands gave rise to intense opposition to Indian self-government in British circles, who did not share the ideals of the Round Table. Finally, the actions of the British opposition drove Gandhi from non-resistance to non-cooperation to civil disobedience, destroying the whole purpose of it. Was Gandhi a false flag individual? I don't know, but makes sense. That's how the British tend to function and think and look at things. Skip the parts about Ireland. Not a whole lot there, unless you're Irish, I guess. You could check out Tim Kelly's talk, The Irish Holocaust. That's an interesting discussion that would relate to this and what Quigley says. Then we're going to get into China and the Far East. This is, of course, where the British Empire, through the Silk Road networks, through these formerly, I believe, French-held networks of opium and so forth, are taken over by others such as the British and the Americans, and then these provide a means by which to weaken China, the imperial China. This will be discussed at more length later in the book. This is not really what Quigley goes into, but he's just basically touching on what's going on in the Far East prior to World War I, and what is it that leads up to World War I. Now, we get to section 5 here, the growth of internal tensions. This is where we're going to get what's really going on with the lead up to World War I. And this is the creation of the Triple Alliance in 1871 to 1890. The German Empire, dominated by the Kingdom of Prussia, left Bismarck politically satisfied. He had no desire to annex additional Germans to a new empire. His immediate aim was to keep France isolated. So we have this kind of back and forth between Germany, Prussia, versus France, versus the British, and then, of course, Russia plays into this. So a whole bunch of leagues and pacts and treaties, and I mean, there's a whole, you can read all about these, page 213. This leads up to the Triple Entente of 1890 to 1907, and the isolation of Russia and France, combined with a number of more positive factors, bring about the dual alliance of 1894. Russian antagonism towards Austria and the Balkans, and French fear of Germany along the Rhine was increased by Germany's refusal to renew the reinsurance treaty and the early renewal of the Triple Alliance in 1891. Both powers were alarmed by the growing signs of the Anglo-German friendship at the time of the Heligoland Treaty in 1890 on the occasion of the Kaiser's visit to London in 1891. Finally, Russia needed foreign loans for railroad building and industrial construction, and these could be obtained in Paris. Accordingly, the agreement was closed by the New Year celebrations in 1894, the form of a military convention. This provided that Russia would attack Germany if France were attacked by Germany, or Italy, supported by Germany, while France would attack Germany if Russia was attacked by Germany or Austria. I mean, what? Yeah, so this is, of course, the history of, the Holy Roman Empire and all the different endless factions and so forth. But this is, again, great game period, 1890 and on. Russia versus Britain, Germany in the midst of this in the middle. The British agreement with Russia in 1907 followed a course not dissimilar to the British agreement with France in 1904. Britain had suspicions of Russia for years and their rivalry in the Near East. And many of those escapades are covered in essays that Mark Hackert has translated at Espionage History Archive. By 1904, these suspicions were deepened by a growing Anglo-Russian rivalry in Manchuria and North China, Eurasia. Halford Mackinder. The control of Eurasia is control of the world. And were brought to a head by the Russian construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. So this all plays into the Great Game. Now, going into the Triple Entente is very confusing, very elaborate. There's not really any way to completely deal with this in this talk, but suffice to say that you've got your major powers, and it's all about controlling. Obviously controlling all the markets and all as much as you can. It's empires in war. But what leads to the state of war is going to be the situation of the international crises of 1905 to 1914. And he calls this the decade from the Entente Cordiale to the outbreak of war witnessed this whole series of political crises which brought Europe periodically to the brink of war, hastened the buildup of armaments all around, popular hysteria, nationalist chauvinism, and a solidity of alliances to a point where a relatively minor event in 1914, the Black Hand assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, plunges the world into World War I. And many suspect that the Black Hand was this Serbian nationalist group with kind of esoteric secret society connections, perhaps was provoked by the British. And these crises are the 1905 crisis of the Moroccan Algeciras Conference, 1908 Bosnian crisis, 1911 Second Moroccan crisis, 1911 Tripolitan War, 1912 First Balkan War, 1913 Second Balkan War, 1913 Albanian crisis, 1913 Lamont von Sanders affair, 1914 Sarajevo, and then of course we have the Black Hand assassination. And was this a machination of British intelligence? Many seem to think so. Webster Tarpley proposes that thesis. It does make sense, right? This is what the elite want. They wanted the war. Quigley will go on to say this. He will explicitly say that, the bankers pretty much wanted the war, and that's why it happened. Because it's a bigger game. It's always about moving towards consolidation, global government. And it's the shadow Atlantis' banking establishment that wants that government. They want that New World Order control. So, there's so many things that are going on here. It's just phenomenal that all the information that's in Quigley's book is very difficult to try to distill it all. But the 215, we have this. I mentioned that Russia and the UK coming out of the period of the Great Game, and the U.S. Now, this is where it begins to get really heated and sexy. The U.S. is brought into World War I. And this is explained by Quigley as follows. The most important diplomatic event of the latter part of the First World War, this is page 249, was the intervention of the United States on the side of the Entente powers in April of 1917. The cause of this event have been analyzed in great length. In general, there are 4 reasons given for the intervention from 4 different points of view that might be summarized as follows. 1. The German submarine attacks on neutral shipping made it necessary for the United States to go to war to secure the freedom of the seas. The United States was influenced, this is point 2, the United States was influenced by subtle British propaganda conducted in drawing rooms, universities, and the press on the eastern part of the U.S., where the Anglophile network was rampant amongst influential social groups. Point 3, the United States was inveigled into the war by a conspiracy of international bankers and munitions manufacturers. Well, guess what? All three of those are true. Oh, and point 4, the balance of power principles made it impossible for the United States to allow Great Britain to be defeated by Germany. Yes, exactly. All of these are true. Quigley's more or less hinting at this. Now, what provokes this? The sinking of the Lusitania, page 250, 251. Now, Quigley doesn't explicitly say this is a false flag. He talks all around it and says it could have been, maybe, perhaps, done by the British themselves. Right? And he all but says it. In other words, it was. Right? It was false flag. Now, what does he say? Well, let's read here what he says explicitly. Quigley states on 250, the Germans at first tried to use established rules of international law regarding the destruction of merchant vessels. This proved so dangerous because of the peculiar character of the submarine itself, the British control of the high seas, the British instructions to merchant ships to attack submarines, and the difficulty of distinguishing between British ships and neutral ships, that most German submarines tended to attack without warning. American protests reached a peak when the Lusitania was sunk in this way 9 miles off the English coast, May 7th, 1915. The Lusitania was a British merchant vessel, quote, constructed with government funds as an auxiliary cruiser, expressly included in the naval list published by the British Admiralty, with bases laid for mounting guns of 6-inch caliber. So it had guns, carrying a cargo of 2,400 cases of rifles, 1,250 cases of shrapnel, and so the German order was to attack ships carrying such munitions. And he goes on. It carried 785 of a possible 1,257 passengers, including 128 Americans out of 128 of 197 Americans lost their lives. The incompetence of the acting captain contributed to the heavy loss, as did a mysterious second explosion that occurred after the German torpedo struck. The vessel, which was declared unsinkable, went down in 18 minutes. The captain was on a course he had orders to avoid. He was running at a reduced speed. He had an inexperienced crew. The portholes had been left open. The lifeboats had not been swung out. No lifeboat drills were held. The propaganda agencies of the Entente powers made full use of the occasion. Whoa, well, of course. The Times of London, the Chatham House roundtable mouthpiece, announced 4/5 of her passengers were citizens of the United States. The actual number was 15%. So, again, British propaganda to get the U.S. into World War I. The British manufactured and distributed a medal that they pretended had been awarded to the submarine crew by the German government. A French paper published a picture of the crowds in Berlin at the outbreak of World War in 1914. Fake news stating Germans rejoice at news of the sinking of the Lusitania. Fake news, 1914, World War I. Fake news, propaganda, psyops, Times of London, French papers, lies, 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 lies. The United States protested violently against submarine warfare, but international law had been broken. President Wilson refused to go along with this, right? Meanwhile, Germany was seeking an alliance with Mexico if war began, which would, of course, be relevant to geostrategic location next to the United States, right? So it fails. Or in other words, the PSYOP and the false flag works. And the U.S. enters into World War I, and this begins the move away from this, at least verbally expressed, policy. It wasn't real, but the popular idea that America doesn't get involved in foreign entanglements, that begins to change through this false flag event. But now I want you to stop and you got to think about this, right? So we think about stage news, fake news, Sandy Hook, made up stories, BBC, CNN, right? We think about this, oh, this is happening. This is this thing that's new. No, this is 100 years ago. 100 years ago, and this is what starts wars. These baloney psyops events. Now he goes on to 252 to discuss the breakup of the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire. This is, again, to weaken Germany. This is the point of all this. France, Belgium, Britain, right? Nobody wants to be under Germany. Nobody wants to be under these Catholic powers. Nobody wants to be under the Vatican. Nobody wants to be under these things. Get away with all that. Give us our Masonic freedom and Republican democratic governments, and we'll all be happy and create our Platonic Republic utopia, which ends up being hellholes. But nevertheless, we're all just going to believe that's where we're going to go. And so we get the new freedom doctrine of Wilson, and this is discussed in 253. The German note to President Wilson asked for an armistice on the basis of the 14 points of Wilson's January 8th, 1918, and the subsequent principles of September 27th, 1918. The statements of Wilson captured the imaginations of idealistic people everywhere. They're 14 points. Promise, right? Let's think of this bullshit. The end of secret diplomacy. Sounds like Obama. Freedom upon the seas. Freedom of commerce. Disarmament. A fair settlement of colonial claims. The interests of native people being equal with those of imperialist powers. The evacuation of Russia. Russia must leave all of its colonies and lands. The evacuation and restoration of Belgium. The evacuation of France and restoration of her Alsace-Lorraine as in 1870. Autonomous development for the people of the Habsburg Empire. Away with this empire. Give us freedom. Give us Masonic democracy. Constitutions and republics. The evacuation, restoration of the guarantee of Romania, Montenegro, Serbia. So it's just across the board, right? Freedom for the autonomy. I mean, these 14 points are utterly retarded propaganda is what they are. And they're means by which, once again, people buy into the baloney. And you have to understand in the West, and I'm not a Roman Catholic, but from the vantage point of the bankers who co-opted eventually the Vatican through Vatican Bank, right? The Rothschilds have been since the 1700s, the papal bankers, and then other Protestant Calvinist banking and Jewish banking would tie into this. Get away with all this Catholicism, right? Now, I'm not saying I believe the Roman Catholic view, but what I'm saying is that they do want to dispense with this entity in this period. And even though they decide, I'm speaking of kind of the shadow Masonic banking cabal, they decide, as we know from the Alta Vendita documents, which you can find online, well, maybe we don't need to just get rid of this thing. Maybe we need to co-opt this powerful institution and get it to breathe a new Catholicism into the world, a kind of new world order version of Catholicism. Again, this is described in Leo XIII's encyclical Humanum Janus, which deals with Freemasonry. All the papal encyclicals that deal with Freemasonry, as well as the Alta Vendita statements from the Grand Orient Lodges. And you can find all of that all explicitly laid out in those documents. And that's what Quigley's talking about here. He's not saying Masonry, right? But he talks about all these institutions like socialists, Marxists, right, that are Masons. So right, just insert Mason anytime you see the liberal, freedom, democracy, socialist, Marxist, communist types, and you get the picture. So this is pages 252, 253, And this represents the breakdown of the vestiges of Catholic state power in the West. Now, this seems very foreign to people nowadays, but prior to this period, this was the norm. You had Catholic monarchs, right? At least that weren't Protestants. Okay, so yes, since the Reformation, you had the beginning of the princes leaving to form their own church, and then the Lutheran Church is, of course, all these Protestant kings who prefer that, right, because of the geopolitical power of the Roman See. So that you have to understand all that to get a picture of what else is going on. Most people don't understand this because they don't have a clue about what Catholicism is and so forth, and they don't understand Catholic theology. Certainly Quigley has no clue what he's talking about when he talks about theology. He's terrible at it. But this whole Entente Supreme War Council refused to accept the 14 points as the basis of the peace until Colonel House threatened the United States would make a separate peace with Germany. Colonel Edwin Mandell House, the secret banking power behind the 14 points of President Wilson. The League of Nations, right? Mutual guarantees of political independence. The UN, or excuse me, League of Nations, is what comes out of World War I. So this is what's going to start this big chain reaction, I guess you could say, this event here. World War I is the provocation, the Lusitania, the breakup of the Habsburg Empire, assassination of Franz Ferdinand by the secret society Black Hand that looks like probably British intelligence. German Revolution was spreading. The Kaiser abdicated November 9th. German negotiators received from the Entente military terms and asked for an immediate ending of all hostilities, an economic blockade, reduction in the Entente demand for the machine guns and so forth, suppressed the German Revolution. Armistice was signed, and then we're going to come up to the Germans were also required to renounce the treaties of Brest-Litovsk and of Bucharest. They put all these strictures on Germany. Do this, do this, do this, do this. You will submit to Western freedom. The negotiations with Wilson leading up to the Armistice of 1918 are of great significance since they form one of the chief factors in subsequent German resentment of the Treaty of Versailles. In the negotiations, Wilson had clearly promised that the peace treaty with Germany would be negotiated and would be based on his 14 points. As we shall see, the Treaty of Versailles was imposed without negotiation. The 14 points fared very poorly in its provisions. An additional factor connected with these events lies in the subsequent claim that German militarists that the German army was never defeated but was only stabbed in the back. And now this is where it gets juicy. By the home front through a combination of international Catholics, international Jews, international socialists. Right, so liberal Catholics, international Jews, international socialists are who are concerned, according to German militarists, with wrecking Germany. Well, guess what? That's true. They were. And even though Quigley says there is no merit to these contentions, no, Quigley actually is wrong, and will kind of halfway admit later on in the book that it's right. This will, of course, lead up to World War II, and it was the banking establishment in Germany at that time, which was significantly Jewish, that was ruining Germany through debt. And this is, of course, a long-standing vendetta of Jews versus Catholics. And many of these, quote, international Catholics that Quigley is dismissing, these are Masonic people. Okay, these are not Catholics. These are liberal Catholics. Liberalization of the Catholic Church has been going on since the 1700s. Okay, so you can read Clement's 1700 something, I forget what, encyclical Pope Clement, whatever, back in the 1700s on Masonry. So this is nothing new, been going on for a long time, and all the way into the 1800s. You can read papal encyclicals in the 1800s condemning modernism, Mirari Vos, I believe Gregory 17th, 16th, Gregory 16th. You can read Pius X's Lamentabili San, Sane. You can read, again, it's Pacendi Dominici Gracious, Pius X. You can read Leo the 13th's encyclicals, all condemning modernism, all foisted by the lodges. And that's what's going on in the background that Quigley kind of talks around. Okay, he's not denying Masonic conspiracies. I don't think he's aware of this really, but he's essentially covering the same information under the denomination, quote, socialist or liberal or internationalist, right? These are the terms that he's using, which actually mean what we're talking about here. And, of course, the Masonic powers also were largely under the Lodge of England. Now, not all of them. There's supposed to be some sort of so-called division between Grand Orient and then the English Lodge. I'm not sure that that's really as divisive as it's made out to be. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not in those circles, but to me, it looks like they're all preaching the same stuff, right? It's roads that lead to the same doom. So, take the left path, the right path, doesn't matter. They all lead to the same end. And we have more discussion of the gold standard economics going on in the background. The bankers running the scams still into this period, especially page 257. Gold reserves, the great powers run the gold standard, with banknotes and paper money could be converted into gold on demand. However, each country suspended the gold standard at the outbreak of the war. This removed the automatic limitation on the supply of paper money. Then each country proceeded to pay for the war by borrowing from the banks. There you have it. War is a racket. General Smedley Butler. And so that's the big story here. That's what's going on in the background. Public debt. That's what it's about. Bring these people into debt. The war is good, especially for whoever loses, because then the bankers come in and say, oh, you owe war reparations for the next 30 years. Your children are in debt forever. Pay for your sins, evil people, even though people had nothing to do with it. Then we're going to get to the Versailles system, the return to, quote, normalcy, 1919 to 1929. This is big victory for the bankers after World War I, right? Treaty of Versailles with Germany. The peace settlements of 1919 to 1923. So I think that's going to conclude part one, and we're going to get to more really juicy stuff with the Bank for International Settlements. It's established, the central bank of central banks, established post World War I. That's what the bankers get out of the World War I League of Nations, and their real power base with the Bank for International Settlements. And this is going to be the establishment of the Bretton Woods system. And we're going to see how that comes to result out of this Bank for International Settlements, right? Pages 270 to 271. We will go into more detail on this in lecture 2, but we're going to talk about the Peace Conference, League of Nations, Peace Conference, Versailles, all different treaties that are signed throughout this period that lead to this looting of Germany, really, at the behest of the Round Table Oxford banking dons, mafia dons. And this is going to affect, of course, the economic situation. The West will see a boom. We'll see the 20s period, the 20s boom period. And then we're going to have, of course, the collapse, the depression, the boom bust, crazyflation, as we might call it, leading to the depression. Again, engineered by the banksters. And all the same suspects, the usual suspects, are going to make their reappearance, their dynasties. But most important will be to understand this Bank for International Settlements this situation that's going to come out of come out of what we're seeing here, even back at the World War I period. And this will lead us to World War II, right? So the Treaty of Versailles was presented to the plenary conference May 6, 1919, to the German delegation the next day. And this is, again, rearranging of the existing power structures, ultimately leading towards global government. Because you have to keep in mind that the circles that are engaging in this have an ideology, and they're not just pragmatists. They are very pragmatic, of course, but they're committed to this technocratic, managerial, scientistic view, and Quigley will talk about that. Just like what Huxley talks about, right? And Huxley's in these circles. He's one of these people, and they are determining the destiny of the world, really. So that's where we're going to go next, is getting in, seeing how this relates to the Bank for International Settlements and League of Nations. Now, again, what we get first is League of Nations, right? International Banking Fraternity, he discusses on page 271, and that's who's drawing up all of this war scam for the losers. So you've been listening to Jay's analysis, and this is part 1 of Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. Thanks for listening, and be sure and tune in next week. We'll move to the second chunk, lecture 2, see how far we can get.